My wife walked out of our house every night for 32 days. She never remembered leaving. She always walked to the same abandoned house at the edge of town. I thought she was sleepwalking. I thought she was having an affair. I even thought she was losing her mind. I was wrong. 3 months later, I found a photograph of my 6-year-old daughter inside the coffin of a woman who had been dead for 17 years. And that's when I realized my family had never been the target. We had been the ritual. My name is Wesley Doucet. I live in Beauclair Parish, Louisiana, about 40 minutes north of Lafayette, if you know the back roads, and closer to an hour if you don't. It's October now, 26 days past my daughter's half-birthday. My wife is asleep in our bed upstairs. My daughter is asleep in the room across the hall. I check on her every 40 minutes. I have my reasons. I'm doing this on a cassette recorder because I don't trust computers not to lose things, and because I need somebody besides me to know the shape of what happened this summer. If I get it wrong, if the shape I remember isn't the shape it actually was, I want somebody to be able to look at it later and set it right. That's all. I'm not doing this because it's over. I want you to understand that up front. I'm not sitting here with a story I've made peace with. I'm sitting here at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning because I can't sleep, and because there's a thing I found in my truck 2 weeks ago that I haven't told my wife about, and because every time I close my eyes, I hear my 6-year-old say something she said in July that I would give both my hands to unhear. I'm going to start at the beginning. The beginning is a good night. I want you to know it was a good night before it wasn't. First weekend of June, 2006. My brother Randy drove down from Alexandria with a cooler full of Abita and his boy Trey, who was 9 and had just gotten a Game Boy for his birthday and would not put it down for love or money. We were doing a crawfish boil in the side yard. I'd bought 2 sacks off a guy at the co-op that morning, 30 pounds each, live and mean. Ellen was in the kitchen cutting up potatoes and corn, and my daughter Cora was under the picnic table with her stuffed rabbit, Mr. Beans, having a conversation with him about whether or not he was allowed to have crawfish. She'd decided he wasn't. He was a vegetarian, she said. She'd made the decision on his behalf. Randy had the burner going and the boil pot up to a rolling foam. The whole yard smelled like cayenne and zatarains and hot grass. Cicadas were going in the pines, out past the driveway. That steady wall of sound you stop hearing after about 10 minutes of living down here. Ellen came out with the potatoes in a colander, and Randy whistled at her, and I threw a beer cap at him, and Ellen laughed and said, "Wes, your brother's flirting with me again." And Randy said, "Ellen, one of these days you'll come to your senses and marry the good-looking Doucet." And Ellen said, "Randy, honey, if I was going to trade in Wes, I wouldn't trade sideways. I'd trade up." And Randy grabbed his chest like he'd been shot, and Trey laughed without looking up from his Game Boy. And I sat there in my folding chair with a sweating bottle in my hand and thought, I remember this exactly. I thought, this is about as good as it gets, right here. That's the part I need you to hold on to. We ate at the picnic table until it was dark. Ellen outdrank Randy, which was not a hard thing to do. But she also outdrank a friend of mine named Coop, who'd wandered over from across the road. And Coop was a serious man about a beer. She won $5 off him on some bet I didn't catch the start of. She kept the bill folded in her back pocket the rest of the night like a trophy. Cora fell asleep on my lap around 10, with crawfish tail juice on her chin, and Mr. Beans jammed up under her arm. I carried her inside, and Ellen tucked her in, and we came back out and sat with Randy, while he finished his beer and told a story about a guy at his job who'd swallowed a bee. It was a good story. Randy tells a good story. Around 11:30, Randy and Trey loaded up and left, and Coop wandered back across the road, and Ellen and me stood in the yard for a while listening to the frogs. She had her arm hooked through mine. She said, "Baby, that was a good night." I said, "It was." Then we went in. I want you to picture the drive home from a night like that, except it wasn't a drive because we were already home, but earlier, coming back from the co-op with the crawfish sacks in the truck bed. Ellen had said something I keep coming back to. We were on Old Purdue Road, which is the logging road our house sits on. It dead ends about a mile past our driveway at the river. Nobody lives past us. Nobody's lived past us since before we moved in. And Ellen was looking out the passenger window at the tree line, and she said, real casual, "Wes, did that house on the end of Purdue always have somebody living in it?" I said, "Which house?" She said, "The old shotgun, past the bend. I could have sworn I saw the porch light on." I slowed down. I looked. There was no porch light on. There couldn't have been. That house had been boarded up as long as I'd been alive, and I told her so. She said, "Huh, weird." And she reached over and turned up the radio, some old Doug Kershaw song, and started singing along, and I forgot about it. I forgot about it entirely. It didn't come back to me until 3 weeks later, sitting on the edge of our bed at 4 in the morning, with my wife's mud-caked feet in my hands, and by then it was too late for a lot of things. Monday morning I was at the mill by 6. I run the day shift at Beauclair Lumber, been there 11 years, foreman for the last 4. It's a good job if you don't mind sawdust in your teeth, and it's a bad job if you do. That morning we were running loblolly pine through the big wood miser, and one of the guides was chattering, and I spent the first 2 hours crawling around under a running blade with a wrench, which is a fine way to remember you're mortal. Around 10, a call came in for me at the office. Denise, our secretary, waved me over. It was Ellen. She said, "Wes, I can't find my keys." I said, "You drove to work, Ellen." She said, "I know, but now I can't find them." I laughed. She laughed. I told her to check her purse, her drawer, the break room. She said she'd already checked. I told her I'd come by on my lunch hour if she couldn't find them by then. She said okay, and told me she loved me, and hung up. I want to tell you about a co-worker of mine, because he said something that stayed with me the wrong way. His name was Percy Fontenot, and Percy was 62, and worked the planer with the same slow, steady rhythm he'd worked it for 40 years. Percy was the kind of man who knew everybody in the parish, and everybody's business, and he wasn't a gossip so much as an archive. During break, we were sitting on the loading dock with our sandwiches, and Percy said, "Everything all right at home?" I said, "Sure." He said, "Denise said Ellen sounded off." I told him she just couldn't find her keys. Percy chewed for a while. Then he said, "My Louise, when she hit 35 or so, she started doing stuff. Putting the milk in the cabinet, locking herself out, losing whole afternoons. Went on about a year. Doctor called it a change." He shrugged. "Wasn't nothing to it in the end, but it was a rough year." I said, "Ellen's only 32. Percy said, "Everybody's timing's different." Then he ate the rest of his sandwich and didn't say anything else about it. "I want to be honest with you about something." Percy planted a seed there. I didn't feel it at the time, but I know I did, because when the strange things started, I reached for that seed with both hands. It was easier than the alternative. It was so much easier. I found Ellen's keys that night. They were in the freezer, on top of the bag of peas. We laughed about it. She said maybe her brain was leaking. I said maybe she was trying to freeze the truck so it stopped making that grinding noise. She kissed me. We went to bed. I want you to notice something. I want you to notice that at no point did either of us say, "Ellen, when did you open the freezer?" Because Ellen doesn't cook with peas. She hates them. Cora hates them worse. That bag of peas had been in the freezer since Ellen's father brought it over sometime in the spring, because he'd bought a variety pack at Winn-Dixie and didn't want them. Neither of us had opened that freezer in weeks, except to grab ice. I didn't think about it then. I thought about it later. The first time I found her outside, it was a Wednesday night, about a week after the crawfish boil. I woke up because our old box fan hitched. It did that sometimes when the belt was worn, and I reached for Ellen the way I always do when I half wake, and her side of the bed was empty. I want to describe the sheet to you because I remember it clearly. Her side was cool. Not cold, not warm. Cool. Which means she'd been up a little while but not long. I sat up. The clock on the nightstand said 3:20. I called her name. Nothing. I got up and walked through the house in my shorts. Kitchen empty. Living room empty. Cora's door cracked. Cora asleep, breathing that soft, snory breathing she does. Bathroom empty. I found her on the back porch. She was standing at the top of the steps with her hands at her sides, facing the road. She was barefoot. She had on the long t-shirt she slept in, the one with the faded Saints logo on the front. She wasn't moving. She wasn't rocking or swaying. She was just standing there, looking out into the dark, like a person waiting for a ride. I said her name. I said, "Ellen. Hey, Ellen, baby." She didn't turn. She didn't even blink that I could see. I want to tell you what that felt like. I've seen my wife every morning for 9 years. I know what her face looks like when she's thinking, when she's mad, when she's about to laugh, when she's sleeping, when she's pretending to sleep. That night on the porch, her face was doing something I'd never seen it do. It was just off, like a house with the lights on and nobody home, like a photograph of Ellen instead of Ellen. I touched her elbow. Nothing. I said her name again, louder. Nothing. So I did what I'd read one time you're supposed to do with a sleepwalker. I didn't shake her. I didn't shout at her. I just took her hand and turned her gently and walked her back to bed. She walked. She let me. Her hand was warm. She got in bed and pulled the sheet up and rolled onto her side and was asleep within about a minute. The kind of sleep where your mouth falls open. I lay there next to her the rest of the night with my eyes open. Around 5 I got up and made coffee. When Ellen came in at 6:30, she yawned and said, "Wes, I had the wet cotton dream again." I said, "The what?" She looked at me like I was slow. She said, "The dream. The one about the wet cotton. I've told you about it 100 times." I said, "Refresh me." She said, "I've had it since I was a kid. There's a lady humming somewhere I can't see her, and it smells like wet cotton, like the smell of a laundry line before a storm. That's it. That's the whole dream. But I always wake up sad." I asked her if she remembered getting up in the night. She looked at me blank. She said no. I asked if she'd been anywhere near the porch. She laughed and said, "Wes, what are you talking about?" I told her never mind. I told her she'd been snoring. She threw a dish towel at me. I did not tell her. That's the first thing I want to confess. I did not tell her. I told myself I didn't want to worry her over a one-time thing. I told myself sleepwalking was normal. I told myself a lot of things that morning, and none of them were the real reason. The real reason was Percy's seed. The real reason was that some small part of me had already decided that whatever was going on with my wife was going to be easier to fix if I understood it before she did. I want you to remember that. I made that decision. Nobody made it for me. That's on me. Cora was 6 years old that summer. I want to tell you about her because otherwise the rest of this won't hit right. She was in the between-teeth stage, the front 2 out, and the new ones coming in crooked. She had Ellen's hair, that reddish auburn that goes almost blonde in the sun. She had my ears, poor kid. She was scared of exactly 3 things in the whole world: the vacuum cleaner, thunder, and a lady on a cereal commercial, who was supposed to be a friendly bumblebee, but whose face was drawn wrong, in some way that gave Cora the creeps. She would not eat if her peas touched her mashed potatoes. She had named her stuffed rabbit Mr. Beans after a movie she'd only seen the first 10 minutes of at Randy's house. She loved her mother the way small girls love their mothers, total, uncomplicated, with her whole small body. And she loved me too, in the different way that daughters love their daddies, which is that she liked me best when I was making a fool of myself. The morning after that first porch incident, Cora came out for breakfast and climbed up on her chair and said, without looking up from her cereal, "Daddy, I heard Mama singing to somebody last night." I put down my coffee. I said, "Yeah? Who was she singing to?" Cora shrugged. She said, "The lady in the yard." I said, "There wasn't any lady in the yard, sweetheart. That was a dream." Cora accepted that. She said, "Okay." She poured too much milk into her cereal, the way she always did. She kept eating. I want to tell you exactly what my heart did in that moment. It didn't drop. It didn't race. It just went a little quiet, the way a dog goes quiet when it hears a noise you can't hear. That was all. I filed it. I filed it under Kids Say Weird Things, and I would have kept it filed there. Honestly, I would have. Except 3 nights later, Ellen walked again. This time she made it to the mailbox. I woke up at 3:14. I noted the time because our nightstand clock was digital, and I was staring right at it when my eyes opened. Her side was cool again. I didn't call for her this time. I got up and went straight out the front door. The mailbox is at the end of our driveway, about 60 feet from the porch. She was standing next to it, with one hand on the post, facing down the road. Same posture, same not there face. The hem of her nightgown was wet. I want to explain something about our property. Our house sits back off Old Purdue Road, on about 3 acres of pier and beam, mostly yard, mostly woods. The yard is silt, black river silt, sticks to your boots, tracks black on the floor. The road is crushed shell, which is white. The drainage ditch between the yard and the road is a thin, scummy trickle most of the summer. Her feet were red. I don't mean bloody. I mean caked in red clay, up to the ankles, dried and cracked in places, like she'd been walking through it while it was wet, and it had started to set. There is no red clay on our property. There is no red clay in our ditch. The nearest red clay I know of is the logging cut about 2 miles east, or Dale Lemoyne's property on the other side of the parish. I want to be honest about what happened next in my head, because I'm not proud of it. The first thing I thought when I saw that red clay was not my wife is sick. The first thing I thought was Dale Lemoyne. Ellen dated him in high school for maybe a year, back before I ever knew her. He was a mechanic in town, married now to a woman named Ruth who worked at the credit union with Ellen. Dale was one of those good-looking dumb boys who peaked at 19 and knew it. I hadn't thought about him in 5 years. I stood there in my yard at 3:15 in the morning, with my wife holding a mailbox post like it was the only thing keeping her upright, and I thought about Dale Lemoyne. That's the kind of man I was that summer. I want that on the record. I got her inside. I got a warm washcloth and wiped her feet off in the tub. The clay came off in flakes, a little at a time. She sat on the edge of the tub with her eyes half open and let me do it and never said a word. When I got her back in bed, she rolled over and started snoring inside a minute. In the morning, I told her nothing again. I made her coffee. I watched her at the counter for a long time before she noticed. When she noticed, she said, "What?" I said, "You sleep okay?" She said, "Wet cotton dream." She rolled her eyes. Again, 3 nights running now. I don't know what's up with me. Maybe I'm working too much. I said, "Maybe." She looked at me a beat longer than she needed to. Then she went back to her coffee. That day, on my lunch break, I drove down to Guy's Photo out on Highway 90, and I bought a disposable Kodak. I put it in the glove box of my truck. I told myself it was in case I got in a wreck. That's a lie, I told myself. I want it on the record too. I started watching her. It was a stupid thing to do, and I did it anyway. I started leaving the mill at odd times and doubling back. I'd tell my guys I was running to the parts store, and instead I'd park my truck a 1/4 mile down Old Purdue and watch our driveway through the trees. I did it 4 times that week. I never saw anything. I saw Ellen leave for work in her little Corolla. I saw the mail lady come. I saw a squirrel do something obscene to another squirrel on the power line. That was all. I was sitting in my truck one afternoon, with the radio on low, K-Bon out of Eunice, playing some old Zydeco thing, and the sun coming through the windshield hot enough to melt lead, and I caught sight of my own face in the rearview mirror. I was 34 years old, and I was sitting in the woods spying on my own wife because she couldn't find her keys and she'd sleepwalked twice. I looked ridiculous. I felt ridiculous. I turned the truck around and drove back to the mill and did not do it again for another week. That night, Ellen caught me being weird. I was pushing my rice around my plate and not eating it, and she watched me for a while, and then she set down her fork and said, "Wes, what?" I said, "Nothing." She said, "You've been looking at me like I owe you money for a week." "What?" Cora was in the living room watching a Blues Clues tape. I could hear the tinny music through the wall. I looked at my wife across the table, and I heard myself say, "Do you ever think about Dale?" She stared at me. She said, "Dale?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Dale Lemoyne?" I said, "Yeah." She put both hands flat on the table. She said, "Wesley David Doucet. Dale Lemoyne eats mayonnaise on white bread and calls it a sandwich. Dale Lemoyne once asked me if Alaska was a country. "What in the hell is wrong with you?" And I laughed. I couldn't help it. I laughed so hard I put my head down on the table. And she started laughing too. And Cora came in from the living room with Mr. Beans and demanded to know what was funny. And I said, "Your mama is funny." And Cora said, "Duh," and went back to Blue's Clues. Later that night we made love, quiet because of Cora, and after Ellen fell asleep with her head on my chest, and I lay there staring at our ceiling fan going around and around, and I told myself the whole thing was over. Whatever it was done. She'd sleepwalked twice. It was a phase. Percy was right. My wife was fine. My family was fine. Ellen walked again the next night. I woke up at 3:14 again. I want you to know I noticed the time again. Twice was not a coincidence. Twice was a pattern. Her side of the bed was cool. I sat up. I listened. The house was doing its old house noises. The pier and beam creak. The fridge hum. The box fan hitch. Nothing else. I got up, and I did not turn on any lights. I don't know why. I went to the front door, and it was standing open behind the screen. The screen door was closed, but not latched. I stepped out onto the porch, and I could see her already, way down the road, a pale shape moving slow. I got in the truck, and I drove after her with the headlights off. You've got to understand what Old Purdue Road looks like at night. It's a logging road. It's crushed shell, white in the moonlight, pines on both sides. No streetlights, no houses past ours, no light at all except the moon, when there is a moon, and there was one that night, a fat, waning gibbous. I could see her about 100 yards ahead of me, walking steady, her Saints t-shirt catching the moon. I crept behind her at about 5 miles an hour. She never looked back. She walked past the bend where the pines get thick, and she walked past the drainage culvert where the road dips, and she walked past the no trespassing sign the parish put up when the county timber lease ran out in '02. She walked for what I clocked, later, from my truck's odometer, at 9/10 of a mile. She stopped at the shotgun house. I hadn't been down that far on Old Purdue in probably 3 years. There'd never been a reason. The house was set back maybe 40 feet from the road on the left side. A little single-story shotgun with a rusted tin roof and boards on all the windows. Kudzu was up over the north wall. The porch steps were half rotted, and there was a piece of yellow parish tape wound loose around one of the posts. It looked exactly like every other abandoned house in South Louisiana. There are 100 of them within 20 miles of here. They rot, they get eaten by vines, they sit. Ellen stopped at the foot of the porch steps. She didn't go up. She didn't try the door. She just stood there. I sat in the truck about 30 yards back with the engine idling, and I watched my wife stand at the steps of a boarded-up house at 3 in the morning for 4 minutes, by the dashboard clock. She didn't shift her weight. She didn't scratch her nose. She stood there the way a person stands at a graveside. Then she turned around and walked back toward my truck. When she got to the passenger side, she opened the door and climbed in, and closed it, and buckled her seatbelt and said, in a voice that sounded almost normal, almost like Ellen, "You're early." Then she leaned her head against the window and was asleep. I drove home with my hands so tight on the wheel that my forearms cramped up. I got her into the house. I got her into bed. She didn't wake up for any of it. I sat on the edge of the mattress in the dark, and I looked at my wife's sleeping face, and I said out loud, real quiet, "What is going on?" She didn't answer. I didn't sleep at all that night. Around 6 I got up and made coffee, and stood in the kitchen, and watched the sun come up through the window over the sink. My hands were shaking. Not bad, just a little, enough to notice. I went back to the shotgun house that Saturday, in daylight, alone. I told Ellen I was running to the hardware store in Opelousas. She said okay and asked me to pick up a box of nails while I was out. She didn't look up from the crossword. The house looked smaller in the sun, older. The boards on the windows were grey and the nails were rust orange. The parish tape had a date on it. Ellen and I read the tape that day actually, when we came back together weeks later, and it said 1989 in faded marker, which was around when a lot of parish stuff got condemned in the last big cleanup. I parked on the shoulder and got out. Cicadas were going. It was already 90 degrees, and it wasn't even 10. I walked up to the porch. I want to describe something to you carefully. The bottom step of the porch was worn smooth in the middle. That by itself is not strange for an old porch. But the smoothness wasn't spread across the step the way 100 years of foot traffic would spread it. It was one spot, about the size of a bare foot, in the exact spot my wife had been standing. I crouched down and I touched it. It was cool. It was smoother than the wood around it. I got out my Kodak and I took 2 pictures of it. I still have those pictures. They came out fine. When I stood up, I looked at the ground at the base of the steps and I saw a cigarette butt. It was a Marlboro Red, filter half crushed, the paper still bright white, fresh, days old, not years. The ground around it was undisturbed dry dirt, except for that one white filter. I don't smoke. Ellen doesn't smoke. Ellen's daddy Emil smokes Winston's and hasn't set foot on Old Purdue Road past our driveway in at least a decade. Whoever had been standing at the foot of those steps had been standing there recently, and it hadn't been anybody I knew. I picked up the butt with a paper napkin from my glove box, and I put it in a Ziploc from the same glove box. I don't know why I did it. I wasn't a sheriff. I wasn't a detective. I was a sawmill foreman, with a wife who sleepwalked and a cigarette butt in a sandwich bag. And I sat there in the driver's seat of my Chevy for a long minute, and I laughed at myself out loud, in a way that wasn't really a laugh. Then I drove into town to the hardware store, and I bought the nails Ellen wanted, and on the way home I stopped at Marceline's. Marceline's Diner is on the parish square, across from the courthouse, and next to the credit union where Ellen works. It's been Marceline's since before I was born, though the current Marceline is the second one. The first one was her mama. Concrete floor, chrome stools at the counter, laminated menus, sweet tea in mason jars, an ancient jukebox in the corner that only plays if you kick it in a certain spot. On a Saturday around noon, it's full of old men who've been drinking coffee since 7, and who consider it their personal duty to know every piece of business in the parish. I sat at the counter. Marceline poured me a coffee without asking. She said, "Wes, you look like hell." I said, "Thanks, Marceline." She said, "I mean it. You getting enough sleep?" I said, "Not lately." She left it alone. There were 4 old men at the counter that day. 2 I'd known my whole life, Boo Melanchon and a guy everybody called Titi, and 2 I only sort of knew. I want you to remember Boo. I want you to remember him from this scene. Boo was up at the end of the counter working on a plate of grits. He was a small, wiry old man, 70-something, missing the last 2 fingers on his left hand from something with a rope years ago. He always wore the same tan Dickies shirt. He never talked much. I sipped my coffee. I said, mild as I could, "Marceline, y'all know who used to live in that old shotgun down at the end of Purdue?" The counter got quiet in the specific way a counter gets quiet when you've asked the wrong question. Titi said, "Oh hell, that was the school teacher's place. Lady named Miss Vidrine. Died back in the 70s. The man next to Titi shook his head. He said, No, that was them Catholic sisters. Back in the 20s. Home for girls in trouble. My mama used to talk about it." Titi said, "Sisters, hell, that was Miss Vidrine." They started arguing. Marceline was standing across the counter from me, and she was not watching them argue. She was watching me. She had the coffee pot in her hand, and she was watching me the way you watch a kid, about to touch a hot stove. Boo Melanchon set down his fork. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at anybody. He just reached into his pocket and put a $5 bill on the counter next to his half-eaten plate of grits, and he slid off his stool, and he walked out the front door. The little bell above the door rang. Nobody at the counter noticed except me and Marceline. Marceline leaned across the counter. She said very quietly, "Shah, whatever you're chasing, chase something else." I said, "Marceline, who lived in that house?" She looked at me. She had grey eyes, Marceline. Real grey, not blue. She said, "That's Merle Fontaine's place, chair. Was. Long time back. She was a midwife. She's dead now. Been dead a long time. Wasn't a good woman." She poured more coffee into my cup even though I hadn't drunk any of it. She said, "Leave it, please. For me, leave it." Then she went to check on somebody's plate at the other end of the counter, and Titi and his buddy went back to arguing about the school teacher, and I sat there with my hands wrapped around my coffee cup, and I said the name in my head for the first time, Merle Fontaine. I want you to hold on to that name. It's about to matter. That Monday I stopped by the credit union at lunch. I told Ellen I was there to deposit my check, but I'd already had it direct deposited a week before. I stood in her line, even though Ruth Lemoyne's window was open. Ellen rolled her eyes at me when I got to the front and said, "You could have used Ruth, weirdo." And I said, "I like your face better." And she laughed and processed a slip I didn't need processed. I watched her while she worked. She looked fine. She looked like Ellen. She laughed with a customer about the humidity. She stapled a receipt. She had a little post-it stuck to her monitor that said "pick up milk" in her own handwriting. I glanced over at Ruth. Ruth was in her 40s, brown blonde hair, the kind of woman who was pretty in high school and hadn't quite made peace with not being 20 anymore. She was Dale's wife. She'd always been nice to me. She caught my eye and waved. When I was walking out, Ruth called after me from her window. She said, "Hey Wes, tell Ellen I finally dug up that thing she asked about. I'll bring it Monday." I stopped. I said, "What thing?" Ruth said, "Oh, just some old stuff of my grandma's. She asked me to look for it a couple weeks back." I said, "Ellen did?" Ruth said, "Yeah. Middle of the night, actually. She called me. I thought it was weird, but I figured she was working on something. One of those genealogy things, maybe." "I finally found the box," I said. "Middle of the night." Ruth laughed. She said, "Like 3 in the morning." I almost didn't answer, but it was Ellen, so I did. I said, "When was this?" Ruth had to think. She said, 2 weeks ago? Maybe a little more. A Wednesday, I think. I remember because I had a headache the next day. I thanked her. I walked out to my truck. I sat in the driver's seat with the door open and the heat coming up off the asphalt, and I did the math. 2 weeks ago, Wednesday, that was the night Ellen had made it to the mailbox. That was the night of the red clay on her feet. I asked Ellen about the phone call that night at supper. Not accusing, just asking. Ellen said, "Wes, I have never called Ruth Lemoyne in the middle of the night in my life. Why would I do that?" I said, "She said you did." Ellen said, "Well, I didn't." "What did she say?" I asked for. I said, "Some old stuff of her grandma's." Ellen said, "Wes, I don't even know Ruth's grandma. What is going on?" I said, "I don't know, baby." We ate the rest of supper without saying much. That night I got out our phone bill. I looked back at the past 2 months. I found the call, outgoing, from our house line, to Ruth Lemoyne's number, on a Wednesday, at 3:14 in the morning. Duration 2 minutes 11 seconds. I sat at the kitchen table looking at that phone bill for a long time. Ellen was already in bed. Cora was already in bed. The kitchen was quiet except for the fridge and the tick of the clock over the stove. 3:14 a.m. I put the phone bill in the drawer, under the silverware, underneath the takeout menus where Ellen never looks. I don't know why. I just did. The last thing I want to tell you before I stop is this. I fell asleep that night sitting up in bed. I don't know when. I must have. Because I came awake all at once with my heart going, and the clock said 3:14, and Ellen's side of the bed was cool. I got up. I did what I'd started doing. I didn't call for her. I didn't turn on lights. I moved. I went down the hall. But this time, before I went out to look for her, I stopped at Cora's room. I don't know exactly why. I'd been checking on her more, since the walking started, without ever really admitting to myself. That's what I was doing. I cracked her door. Cora was sitting up in bed. Her bedside lamp was off. Her blackout curtains were pulled. There was moonlight coming in around the edges of the curtains, just enough to see by. She was sitting straight up under her covers, with Mr. Beans held by one ear in her left hand. Her closet door, which we always kept closed because she used to be scared of it, was standing wide open. She was looking at the closet. She wasn't crying. She wasn't calling for us. She was just sitting up, in the dark, looking. I said, "Cora Bug." She turned her head to me, and she smiled her regular Cora smile, the one with the 2 missing front teeth, and she said, "Hi, Daddy." I said, "What are you doing up, baby?" She said, "The lady in the yard said I don't have to go with her." Mama's going instead. Isn't that nice of her? I want you to understand that I am telling you the exact words. I have thought about the exact words every day since. I am not paraphrasing. I stood in her doorway. I felt my mouth go dry in a way I don't think I've ever felt before or since. I said, "Careful. When did Mama tell you that, sweetheart?" Cora shook her head. She was still smiling. She said, "Not Mama, Daddy." She said, "The other one. The one Mama's letting drive." Then she yawned, big, and lay down, and pulled Mr. Beans up under her chin, and closed her eyes, and was asleep, or looked asleep, before I could say another word. I stood in her doorway in my shorts, and I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The closet door was still open. The moonlight was still coming in around the curtains. Somewhere in the house the box fan hitched. Ellen was not in our bed. Ellen was somewhere out on Old Purdue Road, walking barefoot toward a house I now knew had belonged to a woman named Merle Fontaine, who had been dead since 1989, and who Marceline had told me to leave alone. I closed Cora's door as quietly as I could. I went to find my wife. I found her at the mailbox, not standing this time, sitting. She was on the ground with her back against the post and her knees pulled up, and her hands loose in the grass beside her, palms up. Her eyes were open. She was looking at something across the road that wasn't there. I said her name. Nothing. I crouched down in front of her and put my hand on her cheek, and her skin was warm the way skin should be warm, and I thought for a second she blinked at me. I don't know if she did. I might have wanted her to. I got her up. She walked with me. Her feet were clean this time, dew wet from the grass but no clay, no mud. Halfway up the drive she took a big shaky breath like a person coming out of cold water, and she said, "Wes," in her own voice, and then she started crying. She didn't know why. That was the worst part. She stood there in the yard crying into my shoulder, and she kept saying, "I don't know why I'm crying. I don't know why I'm crying," over and over. We sat on the porch swing until the sky started to gray. She had the wet cotton dream, she said, 3 times back to back. She said the humming was louder this time. She said it was somebody humming a song she almost knew. She wanted to know what it was. I asked her if she could hum it for me. She tried. She couldn't. She said every time she tried, the melody slid off the front of her brain like water off wax. Around 6:30, Cora padded out onto the porch in her pajamas, with Mr. Beans dragging by one ear. She climbed onto Ellen's lap without a word and stayed there. Ellen held onto her like she was holding a rope in a river. She didn't ask Cora what she was doing up. Cora didn't say anything either. The 3 of us watched the sun come up through the pines, and I thought, more clearly than I'd thought anything in a week, I have to tell her. So I told her. I told her about the porch. I told her about the mailbox. I told her about the red clay. I told her about the truck and the shotgun house and the 4 minutes she stood at the steps. I did not tell her about Marceline. I did not tell her about Merle Fontaine. I did not tell her, yet, what Cora had said to me in her bedroom an hour before. I told her enough. She listened without interrupting. When I stopped, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Wes, why didn't you tell me sooner?" I said, "I didn't want to scare you." She said, "Baby, you should have scared me." She was right. She was right, and I knew it. She said, "I'm going to Dr. Landry." Dr. Landry was Ellen's family doctor, over in Lafayette, in one of those brown brick medical parks off Ambassador Caffery. Ellen made the appointment that morning from our kitchen phone. She got in for Thursday, 2 days. Between then and Thursday, Ellen didn't walk. I know because I didn't sleep. I sat up in the recliner in the living room both nights, with the TV on mute and a cup of coffee going cold on the side table, and I watched the hall. Ellen stayed in bed. Cora stayed in bed. The house stayed still. Cora was strange those 2 days. Not scary strange. Quiet strange. She sat closer to Ellen than she usually did. She ate her cereal with her free hand on Ellen's wrist. When Ellen went to the bathroom, Cora waited outside the door. Ellen noticed. She looked at me over Cora's head one morning and mouthed, "What's up with her?" I mouthed back, "I don't know." It was the first lie I'd told her since the porch swing, and I felt it. Thursday morning we drove into Lafayette. Ellen was in the passenger seat with her arms folded and her sunglasses on. She stared out the window the whole drive. About halfway there she said, without turning, "Wes, if he says it's my head, I want you to believe him." I said, "Okay." She said, "I'm not asking, I'm telling you." I said, "Okay, Ellen." She reached over and put her hand on my thigh and left it there the rest of the drive. Dr. Landry was a big, soft-spoken man in his 50s, with a Cajun name and no Cajun accent left. He listened to Ellen with his hands folded on his desk. He took notes. He asked her about caffeine. He asked her about alcohol. He asked her about her cycle. He asked her about stress at work, stress at home, stress with Cora. He asked her about family history of sleep disorders, family history of psychiatric problems, family history of dementia. Ellen said, "My mama died when I was born, so I don't have a lot of family history to work with." Dr. Landry wrote that down. He didn't react to it. Doctors don't. He drew blood. He listened to her heart and her lungs. He shined a light in her eyes. He asked her to touch her nose, and then his finger. He asked her the date and the president and to count backwards from 100 by sevens. She did it faster than I could have. At the end, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Ellen, honey, everything I can see today looks normal. I want to run your blood, and I want to see you back in 2 weeks. In the meantime, I'm going to give you something mild to help you sleep through the night, just for a few days." He wrote a script. Ellen took it and looked at it and folded it in half and put it in her purse. In the parking lot, she got in the car and shut the door and sat there. I got in on my side. I said, "You okay?" She said, "I don't want to take them." I said, "Baby, the man's a doctor." She said, "Wes." She turned to look at me. Her sunglasses were pushed up on her head. Her eyes were red around the rims. She said, "If I take those pills, I won't hear it." I said, "Hear what?" She said, "I don't know." Her voice broke on it. "I don't know, Wes, but I feel like I'm supposed to hear it. And if I take the pills, I won't. And I'm scared of what happens if I don't." She started crying again, right there in the parking lot with the AC blowing, and a woman 2 cars over, loading her groceries. Ellen doesn't cry. In 9 years of marriage, I could count her crying jags on one hand, and 3 of them were at funerals. Watching my wife come apart in the passenger seat of my truck outside a doctor's office because she was scared she wouldn't hear a humming in a dream, that broke something in me that hadn't been broken before. I want to be careful how I say this. It wasn't just fear for her. It was the specific fear of watching a person you know down to the bone start behaving like someone you're going to have to learn. I drove her home. She didn't fill the prescription. I didn't push it. Monday morning, Ruth Lemoyne walked into the credit union with a shoebox. Ellen brought it home at lunch. She set it down on the kitchen table between us and said, "Wes, I have never asked Ruth Lemoyne for anything in my life." The lid had Ruth's handwriting on a post-it. "Ellen, sorry it took me so long to find. Grandma's stuff from the house. Hope it helps with your project." "Ah," I said. "What project?" Ellen said, "I don't have a project." She lifted the lid. The box was maybe 2/3 full of old paper, a brittle envelope of black and white snapshots, a holy card with a woman on the front I didn't recognize, a single sheet of ruled paper folded in half, cross-hatched with names and dates in cramped handwriting, a dried sprig of some plant, brown as tobacco, wound around with red thread the color of stop signs. Ellen picked up the sprig and looked at it, and set it back down like it was hot. I picked up the photographs, 6 of them. Same house, 6 different angles. It took me about 2 seconds to know what I was looking at. The shotgun house. It was younger in the pictures. Fresh paint, white, with dark trim. No boards on the windows. Somebody had planted rose bushes along the porch. There was a sign on a post out front, a hand-painted wooden sign with an arrow, and the arrow pointed at the house, and the sign read, "St. Marguerite Home, for Unwed Mothers Senior A Bouquet, Directress." I turned the photograph over. Somebody had written on the back in pencil, 1931. I said, "Ellen." She was looking at the holy card. She held it out to me. It was one of those old prayer cards. the ones you get at Catholic funerals, thin cardstock with gold along the edges. On the front was a young woman, in a plain grey robe, kneeling at a doorway. There was a baby in her arms, and a shadow on the other side of the doorway that I didn't like. Underneath, in careful old-style lettering, it said, "Saint Marguerite of the Threshold, pray for us who stand between." Neither of us had ever heard of that saint. Ellen unfolded the ruled paper. It was a page from a ledger, hand-copied. You could see where the copier had traced a straight line down the left margin with a ruler. Columns for name, age, arrival date, delivery date, disposition of infant. About 30 entries. Names of women, most of them 15 or 16 or 17 years old. Small towns all over South Louisiana. Some of the dispositions said to family. Some said adoption arranged. A few said, just, did not survive. The signature at the bottom of the page, Bouquet Senior Agnes, Directress. Ellen said, that was a real place. I said, yeah. She said, Wes, that's the house. I said, I know. She stared at the ledger. She said, quietly, why did I ask Ruth for this? We sat with it in front of us for a long time. Cora came home from her half-day of first-grade summer program at 3 and found us at the kitchen table with a shoebox of dead people between us. And Ellen closed the lid before Cora could see and swept the whole thing off to the top of the fridge in one motion. She hugged Cora too hard. Cora squirmed. That night after Cora went to bed, Ellen called Ruth. She had the phone on speaker so I could hear. Ruth answered on the second ring. Ellen said, Ruth, thank you so much for the box. That was really nice of you. But this is going to sound crazy. I don't actually remember asking you for it. Ruth laughed. You okay, honey? Ellen said, I've been a little scattered. When did I ask you for it? Ruth was quiet for a second. She said, Ellen, you called me. Ellen said, when? Ruth said, 3 weeks ago, middle of the night. Woke me up out of a dead sleep. Ellen looked at me across the kitchen. I nodded at her. Ruth said, you asked me if my grandma ever talked about the sisters at the home for girls. I said not really. Then you asked me if she ever mentioned a woman named... Hang on, I wrote it down somewhere. I remember thinking it was weird. We heard her rummaging. Ruth said, here, you asked if she ever mentioned a woman named Merle. That was it. Just Merle. I said no. You said okay and thanks, and hung up. Ellen, are you sure you don't remember this? Ellen said, I don't remember it at all, Ruth. There was a long pause on the line. Ruth said, honey, you want me to come over? Ellen said, no, I'm fine, thank you, really. She hung up. She looked at me. I said, the name I got at Marceline's. It was Merle Fontaine. She was a midwife around here. Marceline told me she died in '89 and wasn't a good woman. Ellen looked at me for a long, slow second. She said, Wesley. I said, I know. She said, you've been holding on to pieces of this. I said, yes. She said, stop. I said, okay. I told her everything then. The photograph of the porch step, the cigarette butt in the Ziploc in my truck, Marceline's face, Boo Melancon, walking out of the diner without finishing his grits. All of it. I laid it out on the table like a hand of cards. When I was done, she got up and went to the fridge and took the shoebox down and put it back on the table between us. She said, okay. Then we work the problem. That was Ellen. That was who I married. Give her a problem and she rolls up her sleeves. Even a problem like this one. Tuesday morning I went to the sheriff. Doyle Guidry had been sheriff of Beauclair Parish for 14 years. He'd been a deputy for the 20 years before that. He was a big man, 6'3", wide across the shoulders, with a soft belly he'd earned since he stopped patrolling, and a face that had gone from handsome to weathered, somewhere around 50. He'd known my daddy. He'd been at my wedding. When Cora was born, he sent Ellen a box of pralines from a place in New Orleans he liked. I walked into the sheriff's office, and Wanda at the front desk said, hey, Wes. And I said, Wanda, is he in? And she jerked her thumb at his door. I knocked. He said, come in. I sat in the chair across from his desk and I told him. Not everything. I told him my wife had been sleepwalking a mile down Old Purdue Road for 4 weeks. that she was walking to the abandoned shotgun house at the end of it, and that I'd found a fresh cigarette butt at the base of the porch steps, and I wanted to know if anybody had been squatting in that house. Guidry listened without moving. When I was done, he leaned back in his chair. The chair squeaked. He looked at me for a long minute. He said, "Wes, who told you about that house?" I said, "What?" He said, "That house. Who told you what it was?" I said, "Nobody told me what it was. My wife walked to it." He said, "But you said the porch step. You said the cigarette butt. That means you went and looked. Who put that in your head to look?" I said, "I put it in my own head. My wife walked there. I followed her. He watched me. He wasn't hostile. He was careful. That's the word. Careful the way a man is careful crossing an old floor." He said, "I'll send a deputy." "When?" I said, "Whenever you can." He said, "Today." I said, "Thank you." I started to stand up. He said, "Wes, sit down a second." I sat. He got up and closed his office door. Wanda's typing sound went muffled. He came back around and sat on the corner of his desk instead of in his chair, which put him a little above me. Not on purpose, just how he sat. He said, "Wes, this is you and me talking, not sheriff and citizen. You understand?" I said, "Okay." He said, "Who told you the name of the woman used to own that house?" I hadn't said a name. I hadn't said Merle Fontaine. I hadn't said anything about a woman. I looked at him. He looked at me. I said, "A friend." He said, "Wes, whoever the friend is, don't nobody else tell you, and you don't tell nobody. You leave it be. You hear?" I said, "Doyle, my wife is sleepwalking to that house every third night." He said, "Then take her to a doctor." I said, "I did." He said, "Take her to a different one." I looked at him. His face didn't move. He said, "I'll send Trosclair down there today. He'll walk the property and let you know what he finds. That's what I can do for you as sheriff. What I'm asking you as a friend of your daddy's is to stop turning that rock over, Wes. Some rocks you leave sit." I walked out of that office with my ears ringing. Ellen and I sat down that night with a legal pad. She wanted to make a list. That's how Ellen is. Ellen makes lists. At the top of the pad she wrote, "What we know." Underneath she wrote, "Sleepwalking. Same time, 3:14. Same destination, the shotgun house. Phone call to Ruth I don't remember making. The house used to be a home for unwed mothers, run by a Sister Agnes Bouquet, from at least 1931. A midwife named Merle Fontaine used to own it or live in it. Marceline says she died in 89. Bad woman. I asked Ruth about Merle by name in a call I don't remember. Cigarette butt at the porch steps. Fresh, unknown smoker. Sheriff Guidry knew Merle's name without being told, and told Wes to drop it. Then she stopped writing and stared at the list. She said, "There's more." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Cora." I hadn't told her yet what Cora had said in her bedroom. I told her then. I gave her the words as clean as I could. "The lady in the yard says I don't have to go with her. Mama's going instead." And I gave her the second thing too. The other one. The one Mama's letting drive. Ellen sat very still. Then she put down the pen and got up and went to Cora's room. I followed her. Cora was asleep with Mr. Beans smashed under her cheek. Ellen stood in the doorway looking at her for maybe 2 minutes. Then she came back to the kitchen and picked up the pen. She wrote, "Cora hears, sees something." Then she wrote, underneath, "Cora is not making it up." Then she underlined it twice. She looked at me. She said, "I need to talk to Daddy." Emile Aubry lived in a little brick ranch house in town, behind the Baptist church. Ellen's mama had died the day Ellen was born, and Emile had raised Ellen alone in the house on Old Purdue Road. Our house, now. The one he'd sold us for cheap in '99, when he'd decided he wanted a smaller place with a paved driveway. Emile was 61. He'd worked 40 years on pipelines, mostly offshore, and he'd retired the year Cora was born. He was a widower who'd never remarried. He drank 2 beers every evening on his porch in a plastic chair, and he watched the news, and he went to bed at 9. I want to be honest about how I felt about Emile. I loved him. I still love him. He was one of the good ones. Grieving, Quiet, closed up, but good. He kept a picture of Colette on his mantle, and never mentioned her name out loud in front of me the entire time I knew him. We went over on a Wednesday evening. Ellen brought a lemon icebox pie, because you don't visit a meal without bringing something. He hugged Cora first. He always hugged Cora first. She squealed the way she squealed for him, and only for him, and he called her petite, and gave her overtures from the dish on his side table. He hugged Ellen next, longer. He shook my hand. We sat on his back porch. He had one of those little Weber grills he'd never used going as a citronella smudge. Coals cold. One of those green mosquito coils burning on the top rack. Cora was in the yard chasing lightning bugs with an old mason jar Emile had punched holes in the lid of. Ellen and I sat in lawn chairs facing him. Ellen said, "Daddy, I need to ask you some things." Emile said, "Okay, chair," she said. "Daddy, do you know anything about a woman named Merle Fontaine?" Emile went grey. I have never seen a man's colour go out of his face that fast. He'd been sunburnt brown from an afternoon in the yard, and then he wasn't, and it happened between two blinks. He set his beer down on the concrete beside his chair. It clinked. He said, "Ellen, where did you hear that name?" She said, "It doesn't matter, Daddy. Do you know it?" He said, "Ellen." She said, "Daddy." He looked at me. Then he looked back at her. He said, "She was a midwife. She's been dead a long time." Ellen said, "Was she at the house the night I was born?" Emile picked his beer back up. His hand was not quite steady. He took a long drink. He looked out at Cora, chasing lightning bugs in the yard. He didn't answer. Ellen said, "Daddy, was she there?" Emile said, quiet, "Yes." Ellen said, "Did something happen that night that you didn't tell me?" Emile said, "Your mama died, Ellen. That's what happened." Ellen said, "Daddy." Emile said, "That's what happened." His voice cracked on it. He didn't shout. He just cracked. He sat there in his plastic chair with his beer sweating in his hand, and he wouldn't look at either of us. Then he said, "You'll need to go." Ellen said, "Daddy." He said, "Ellen, take my granddaughter and go home. I love you. Go home." We left. We left. Cora asked why in the truck, and Ellen said, "Papa's tired, baby." And Cora accepted it. Ellen didn't say another word the whole drive. When we pulled in the driveway, she got Cora out of her booster and carried her inside on her hip, even though Cora was too big to be carried, and Cora didn't complain. That night I woke up around 1, and Ellen wasn't beside me. I got up in a panic. She was in the kitchen, sitting at the table with the shoebox open in front of her, looking at the photographs of the shotgun house one by one under the little pendant light. I said, "Baby." She said, without looking up, "He was there when I was born, Wes." I said, "I know." She said, "And he lied to me." I said, "I don't think he lied. I think he didn't tell you." She looked up. She said, "Wes, there's a difference, and there isn't." I sat down across from her. We looked at each other over the shoebox. I don't remember what else we said. I remember it got light in the window behind her before either of us went back to bed. Thursday morning, Deputy Trosclair called me at the mill. Mark Trosclair was maybe 28, a nice enough kid, from up around Ville Platte originally. He said, "Mr. Doucet, I walked that property yesterday afternoon like the sheriff asked." I said, "And?" He said, "House is boarded up tight. Nobody in it. Nobody been in it in a long time. Front door is nailed shut from the outside. You can see the nail heads are original. Whoever boarded it up in '89 or whenever, that's still the same nails. No sign of entry." I said, "Any cigarette butts?" He said, "One. Marlboro Red, right where you said." He paused. "That's what I wanted to call you about." I said, "Okay." He said, "Mr. Doucet." I walked around behind the house. There's a trail back there. Runs off through the woods east about maybe 120 yards. Ends in a little clearing. Somebody's been on that trail recently. Grass beat down, some fresh boot prints. In the clearing there's I don't know what to call it exactly. A grave marker, I guess. Piece of cypress, about yay high, set in the ground. No name on it. Just a date carved into it. 1962. I said, 1962. He said, "Yes, sir. Old carving. Not new. But somebody's been out there recently. There was fresh cut flowers on the ground in front of it. Not vase flowers. Wild ones. Cone flowers. Looked like. And some black-eyed Susans. Cut, not pulled. Somebody brought a knife." I said, "Mark, does the sheriff know about the marker?" There was a pause. Mark said, "Yes, sir, he does." I said, "How long has he known?" Another pause. Mark said, "Mr. Doucet, I probably shouldn't have called you at all. The sheriff told me to leave it and just tell you the house was clear. I'm calling you because I got a wife too, and she's expecting, and your story bothers me." I said, "Thank you, Mark." He said, "You didn't hear it from me." I said, "I didn't hear it from anybody." He hung up. I sat at the desk in the mill office with the phone in my hand, and I looked out through the plate glass at the yard, at the log deck and the forklifts moving, and I felt my chest go tight in a specific way it hadn't gone tight before. Guidry knew about the trail. Guidry knew about the grave. Guidry had told his deputy not to tell me. I could think of a lot of reasons a sheriff might sit on information about an old grave in the woods. I couldn't think of any good ones. Ruth Lemoyne let me in her front door on Friday afternoon and gave me a glass of sweet tea and sat me down at her kitchen table. Dale wasn't home. I hadn't wanted him to be. I said, "Ruth, I need to ask you about your grandma." Ruth said, "You and Ellen both. She was a nice woman, Ruth. Nicer than her husband deserved. She had a bird feeder in her yard, and she watched it while we talked, the way people do when they don't want to look at what they're saying. She said, Grandma was Odile Menard. She grew up out toward Crotts Springs. When she was 16, she got in trouble. This was 1948. Her folks sent her to the home in Beauclair for the term. She came back and married my granddaddy about 2 years later, and never talked about it, hardly ever. My whole life." I said, "Hardly ever." Ruth said, "Twice, maybe. That I remember." I said, "What did she say?" Ruth thought about it. She said, "Once, when I was little, maybe 7 or 8, I asked her where my mama's older sister was, because there'd been an older sister, my aunt, who was born up at that home and given up. Grandma told me not to ask her that ever again. That was one time." I said, "The other?" Ruth looked out at the bird feeder. A cardinal came down on it. She said, "I was about 12. Grandma was babysitting me. We were watching something on TV. I don't remember what. And out of nowhere she took my hand, real hard, and she said, 'Ruthie, don't you ever let no woman touch a baby's head who ain't the mother. They can put a thing in there you can't get out.' Just like that. Then she let go, and we went back to watching TV like she hadn't said it." I said, "Ruth, did your grandma ever mention Merle Fontaine?" Ruth thought. She said, "That name doesn't sound familiar." I said, "Sister Agnes." Ruth said, "Oh." Her face changed. "Yeah, Sister Agnes she talked about. Not much, and not fondly. She was scared of Sister Agnes. She said Sister Agnes had eyes on you even when she wasn't in the room." I said, "Sister Agnes ran the home." Ruth said, "That's right. Grandma said she was old even then. She had to be. Grandma was in there in 48, and Sister Agnes had to have been 60 by that point, easy." I said, "Ruth, do you have anything else of your grandma's from that time? Anything at all?" Ruth said, "I gave Ellen everything I have. That shoebox was it." I said, "Nothing else? No letters, no?" Ruth said, "Wes, that shoebox is everything that came out of that house when we cleaned it out in '02. Grandma didn't keep things. My mama looked hard when Grandma died. That was it." I thanked her. I stood up. At the door she said, "Wes, is Ellen okay?" I said, "I don't know, Ruth." She said, "You tell her to call me if she needs anything." I mean it. I said I would. I sat in my truck outside her house for 10 minutes with the AC blowing, and I wrote down everything she'd said on the back of a receipt. "Don't let no woman touch a baby's head who ain't the mother. They can put a thing in there you can't get out." I read it back. I sat with it. Then I drove home. Ellen was standing at the foot of our bed, with her hand up to her mouth when I came in the house Saturday morning. She was staring down at the mattress. The fitted sheet was pulled up on one corner, where she'd been changing the bedding, and her pillow was in her other hand. She said, "Wes." I came in. I said, "What?" She held out the pillow. There was a slit in the pillowcase, right along the seam near the zipper. Not torn, cut, clean. A single slice about 2 inches long. She reached her hand in through the slit and pulled out a small cloth pouch. It was about the size of a book of matches, made out of some dark, tight-woven cloth, hand-stitched shut with black thread. The stitches were small and even. It was heavier than it looked. She set it down on the dresser between us. We looked at it. She said, "That was not there when I put this pillow on." I said, "When did you put this pillow on?" She said, "April, Wes. This pillow is new. I bought it at Target in April because you kept complaining about the old one." We didn't touch it for a long minute. Then I got a pair of kitchen scissors, and I sat down at the kitchen table, and Ellen sat across from me, and I cut the thread. 3 things fell out onto the table. A lock of hair, coarse, dark, almost black. 2, maybe 3 inches long, bound with a twist of the same black thread. 3 small bones, white, thin, curved. I'd cleaned enough game birds in my life to know what I was looking at. Chicken vertebrae, neck bones. A single slip of paper, folded twice. Old paper, brown at the edges. I unfolded it. Handwritten in old brown ink, in a careful looping script. Colette Marie Aubry. Ellen made a sound in her throat. I said, "Baby." She said, "That's my mother's name." I said, "I know." She said, "That is my mother's name. Wes." I said, "I know." She sat back in her chair. She put both her hands flat on the table on either side of the little pile. She was breathing shallow. She said, "Somebody has been in our house." I said, "Somebody has been in our house." She said, "Somebody cut open my pillow." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Recently." I said, "Ellen, we need to look." We looked. We started in our bedroom and we tore it apart. Sheets off, mattress up, under the bed, in the nightstand drawers, behind the dresser. We went through every drawer, every shirt pocket in the closet, every shoe. We found the second one, behind the baseboard in Cora's closet. The baseboard was loose. It came off with a fingernail. Inside the wall cavity, wedged between 2 studs about 6 inches down, was another pouch. Same cloth, same stitching. Ellen opened this one at Cora's little pink desk. Inside was a lock of hair, a baby's, fine as spider silk, almost white, and no name. Just a lock of hair. Ellen held that lock of hair in her palm, and she stared at it. Then she got up and went to her jewelry box in our bedroom and came back with a little velvet pouch. She poured the contents into her hand. Another lock of baby hair, identical color, identical fineness. She said, "This is Cora's. This is the lock we saved from her first haircut." She held the 2 locks side by side on her palm. They were the same. She said, "Wes, when did somebody take a second lock of my daughter's hair?" I did not have an answer. We kept looking. We found one under the front porch step. I had to crawl on my back to get it. It was wedged up in a joist. Lock of Ellen's hair, auburn, and a slip of paper folded twice with Ellen Marie Aubry Doucet on it, in the same brown ink. We found one in the attic, buried under the pink cellulose insulation over the guest room, older than the others. The cloth was brittle. This one had no hair. It had a single fingernail clipping, tiny, an infant's, and nothing else. No name, nothing. We found one behind the medicine cabinet in our bathroom. This one the ink was black, sharp, glossy, still black, not old at all. Weeks old, maybe. The lock of hair inside was short and thick, and the color of oak bark. Ellen picked it up and held it out to me on her palm. She said, "Wes." I looked at it. It was my hair. She said, "Wesley, when did anybody get close enough to you to cut your hair?" I stood there in our bathroom, with the medicine cabinet door hanging open, and the little pile of my own hair in my wife's hand, and I thought about it hard. Then I remembered. I said, 3 weeks ago, maybe 4, at the mill. Ellen said, "What?" I said, "There was a woman, old woman, came into the yard on foot. I still don't know where she parked. Actually, I didn't see her car till after. She said she was lost, trying to find 190. She was real sweet, confused. Long dress, straw hat. She had to be 80, easy. She asked me if I could point her back to the highway, and I walked her out to the shoulder because she looked so turned around, and I pointed her the way, and when we got to her car she hugged me, just hugged me. Little tiny old lady, threw her arms around my neck and said, "Thank you, sweet boy, God bless." Then she got in her car and drove off. Ellen said, "What kind of car?" I said, "White Buick. Old one. Big one. LeSabre maybe." I remember thinking it was a boat. Ellen said, "You never told me about this." I said, "Ellen, it was an old lady asking directions. I didn't think about it again." Ellen was quiet. She was holding the lock of my hair in her palm. She said, "She hugged you." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Long enough to cut a piece of your hair?" I said, I guess long enough." "Yeah." Ellen sat down on the toilet lid, hard. She said, "Wes, did she have a bag?" I thought. I said, "A little purse." "Yeah, little black purse hanging on her arm." She said, "Long enough to open a purse." I said, "Ellen." She said, "Long enough, Wes." I sat down on the edge of the tub across from her. We looked at each other in our torn-apart bathroom, with 5 little cloth pouches spread out on a hand towel on the floor between us. Ellen said, "I want to describe her to Daddy." Emil listened on the phone that night. He was quiet the whole time I described her. Little bird of a woman, white hair pulled back, long grey dress like the old ladies used to wear to mass, straw hat, wide brim, blue eyes, real light blue, a voice like she'd been born speaking French and had learned English second. When I was done, Emil was quiet a long time. He said, "Son." I said, "Yeah." He said, "That woman been dead 17 years. The line was quiet. I could hear his old wall clock ticking in the background of his house. I said, "Emil." He said, "Take care of my daughter and my granddaughter, Wesley." He hung up. I sat there with the phone in my hand and the dial tone in my ear, and I did not move for a full minute. Ellen was standing in the doorway of the kitchen watching me. Cora was on the couch behind her watching cartoons. Cora had the volume up, because Cora always had the volume up. Ellen looked at my face, and she came over and took the phone out of my hand and hung it up. She said, "What?" I told her what Emil had said. She sat down at the kitchen table. She put her head down on her arms. She said, "Wes, what is happening to us?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. The shoebox on top of the fridge had a cassette tape in it. We hadn't noticed the first time. Ellen found it Sunday afternoon. She'd been going back through everything Ruth had given us, one item at a time, looking at each thing with a magnifying glass she'd gotten out of Cora's craft box. The cassette had been at the bottom, wrapped in a piece of newspaper, not one of Ruth's grandmother's things at all. Something else. Something added. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. It wasn't the shoebox. Let me get this right. Ellen went to Emil's on Sunday. She hadn't seen him since he'd thrown me off the porch effectively over the phone. She wanted to sit with him. She left me with Cora and drove into town. She was gone 3 hours. When she came back, she was carrying a shoebox. A different shoebox. Wooden, cedar, with a lid that slid. She set it on our kitchen table, and she said, "I went through Daddy's closet." I said, "Ellen." She said, "Don't. He was in the yard." I looked. I had to. She slid the lid off. Inside were maybe 15 cassette tapes. Old ones. Some Memorex. Some TDK. Some with no brand at all. Most were labeled in Emil's blocky print. Songs. Church. Mama's tapes. One at the bottom, though, was labeled in a different hand. A woman's hand. Round loopy letters. Faded blue ink. On a piece of masking tape stuck to the shell. The label read, "For E, if I don't." Ellen held it up. Her hand was shaking. She said, "Wes, that's my mother's handwriting." I said, "How do you know?" She said, "I know it from the back of the picture on Daddy's mantle." The only tape deck we had that worked was the one in my truck. Ellen said she couldn't play it in the house anyway, because Cora was there, and she didn't know what was on it. We put Cora in front of a Blue's Clues tape with a bowl of goldfish and told her mama and daddy needed to sit in the truck for a minute. Cora, who was 6, said okay and did not look up from the screen. We sat in the cab of my Chevy in our own driveway. The AC was on. I put the tape in. I hit play. There was hiss, a long stretch of hiss. Ellen and I sat with our shoulders touching. Both of us leaned forward toward the dashboard speakers. Then a woman's voice. She was young. She sounded tired. She sounded like she'd been up a long time. Her accent was the same as Emile's, the same as Marceline's, the same soft Beauclair parish tongue, where the vowels round out and the R's go soft. She said, "Ellen, that's what your daddy's gonna call you, I guess. And that's fine, Chair. That's a fine name. I want you to know it wasn't the name I picked, but that's all right. Names is names. But baby, I need you to know your real name, in case you ever need it. I picked it out myself. I picked it out for my own mama, who was a good woman. Your real name is..." The tape cut. Not faded, not glitched. Cut. Dead silence. Then hiss. Then the click of the tape running against nothing at the end of the side. Ellen was crying without making a sound. Her hand was over her mouth. Tears were running down her wrist and dripping off her elbow onto her jeans. I ejected the tape. I turned it over in my hands. The tape inside the plastic shell was snapped. I could see it through the little window. It was snapped clean. Not chewed, not stretched. Clean. Like somebody had opened up the housing with a screwdriver and cut the ribbon with something sharp and closed it back up. I said, "Ellen, somebody did this on purpose." She couldn't speak. She just nodded. We sat in that truck for a long time, my hand on the back of her neck, her forehead against the passenger window. She said, "Finally, my mama was trying to tell me my name." I said, "Yeah," she said, and somebody stopped her. I said, "Yeah," she said. "Daddy?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Wes, who else was in that house the night I was born?" I said, "Merle Fontaine." She said the name back, quiet, like she was tasting it. She said, "Merle Fontaine cut my mother's tape." I said, "Maybe." She said, "Merle Fontaine, who my daddy says has been dead 17 years, but who hugged you at the mill last month and took a piece of your hair." I didn't say anything. She said, "Wes, that doesn't make sense." I said, "I know." She said, "Nothing about this makes sense." Her voice broke on it. She hit the dashboard with the flat of her hand, once, hard. The tape jumped in my lap. Then she took a long breath, and she reached across the console, and she took my hand and she said, "Okay, okay, okay, what do we do next?" I loved her so much in that moment, I couldn't look at her. I said, "I don't know." She said, "Then we figure out what to do next." We went inside. Cora was where we left her. The goldfish were gone. Blue was still looking for clues. That night was the last quiet night for a while. We put Cora to bed at 8:30. Ellen read her The Runaway Bunny twice, because Cora asked twice, and Cora fell asleep with her hand fisted in the corner of Ellen's shirt. Ellen sat there for a long time after Cora let go. She sat there with her hand on Cora's back, feeling her breathe. Ellen and I stayed up late in the living room. We put the shoebox from Ruth on the coffee table, and the wooden box from Emile beside it, and the 5 little cloth pouches, lined up on a dish towel, in front of them. We didn't talk. We just looked at it all. Like if we looked at it long enough, some pattern would come clear. Around 11:30 I got up and made sure both doors were locked. I checked the windows. I checked Cora's window twice. Ellen watched me do it and didn't say anything. We went to bed at midnight. I lay on my back with my eyes open for a long time. Ellen curled up against my side with her hand on my chest, and I could feel her not sleeping either. Eventually her breathing got slower, and I thought maybe she'd gone. I turned my head to look at the clock at some point. It was 1:47. Then I must have gone under, because the next thing I knew there was a sound, a high, thin sound, a scream. Cora. I was out of bed before I was awake. Ellen was 2 steps behind me. We hit Cora's door together. Cora was standing in the middle of her bedroom in her nightgown. She was pointing at her closet. The closet door was open. The closet was empty except for her clothes and her toy bin, and the little step stool she used to reach the top hook. She wasn't crying, she was pointing. Her arm was straight out. Her eyes were on the closet, and she wasn't blinking. Ellen got to her first. Ellen was on her knees with her arms around Cora, and Cora was rigid, wouldn't bend. I said, "Cora bug, baby, what?" Cora said, in a voice that was hers, that was completely a 6-year-old's voice, no different than the voice she'd asked me for a second bedtime story in a couple hours before. "Daddy, Mama's not walking to the house anymore." I said, "Baby, come here, come here." Cora said, "The house is walking to us." Ellen made a sound behind her. I looked at the closet. There was nothing in the closet. My daughter was pointing at nothing. I crouched down. I said, "Cora, look at Daddy. Look at Daddy. Right here." She lowered her arm slowly. She turned her head to me. Her face was smooth and calm. She said, "Daddy, when I turn 6.5, they said I go instead. That's next week." Ellen said, "Cora, honey." "Who said?" Cora said, "That's what she said, Mama. She said Mama did her walk, and now it's my turn. She said 6.5 is when I go." I stood up. My legs weren't working right. I walked out of the bedroom and down the hall to the kitchen, and I turned on the light over the sink and I opened the drawer where we kept the calendar. It was one of those cheap ones from the credit union, with photographs of the Atchafalaya Basin on top and a month at a time on the bottom. Cora's birthday was in January. She'd been born January 14th, 2000. Her half-birthday was July 14th. I looked at the wall clock over the stove. It was 1:53 a.m. on July 5th, 2006. 9 days. I stood there in the kitchen in my shorts with the calendar in my hand, and I could hear Ellen in Cora's bedroom, quiet, coaxing Cora back into her bed. I could hear Cora's little voice answering her, calm, agreeable, saying "Yes, Mom," and "Okay, Mama," and "I'm not scared, Mama," in the completely reasonable tone of a child who was reporting weather. I looked at the calendar. 9 days. Ellen came out of Cora's room around 2:15. She'd sat with her until Cora was asleep. She didn't come to the kitchen right away. She stood in the hall, and she looked at me across the length of the house, and she said, "Wes, I'm going to be a person about this." I said, "What does that mean, baby?" She said, "It means I'm not going to fall apart. I'm going to work. So are you." She came to the kitchen, and she sat down at the table across from me, and she pulled the legal pad toward her. She turned to a fresh page. At the top she wrote 9 days. Underneath she wrote, "What could be true?" She said, "Say it out loud. All of it. Everything you don't want to say. I need to hear you say it so I can say it too." I said it. I said that our daughter was hearing something, and that our daughter was not making things up, and that a woman who looked exactly like Merle Fontaine had come to my mill and cut a lock of my hair, and that Emile said Merle had been dead 17 years, and that Sheriff Guidry had known the woman's name before I spoke it, and that somebody had cut open our pillow and hidden a piece of paper with Ellen's mother's name on it inside our own bed, and that our house had 5 of those little pouches in it, and had been carrying them, apparently, since before we ever moved in. Ellen wrote every piece of it down. She wrote in her round handwriting with the little circles over the eyes, the same handwriting I'd read on grocery lists 1,000 times. When I was done, she said, "It's not sleepwalking." I said, "No." She said, "It's not an affair." I said, "No, Ellen." She said, "It's not me losing my mind." I said, "No, baby." She said, "So we treat it like it's real." I said, "Yeah." She said, "Okay." Then she put down the pen, and she said, "Wes, if it takes me, you take Cora, and you go." I said, "Ellen." She said, "Wesley, do not argue with me on this. You take her, and you go to your brothers, and you don't come back. Promise me." I couldn't get any words out of my throat. She reached across the table, and she took my hand. She said, "Promise me." I said, "I promise you." I was lying. She knew I was lying. She let me lie, because we had 9 days, and there wasn't time to fight about it. We went back to Delia Thibodeau on Wednesday. I hadn't told you about Delia yet. That's on me. I got ahead of myself in the last part. Let me catch you up. The Monday after we found the pouches, before Cora screamed in the night, I'd called an old woman named Delia Thibodeau on the phone. Marceline had given me the number after I'd gone back to the diner and stood by the register until she'd come out of the kitchen and looked at me and, without a word, written the number on the back of a receipt and pushed it across the counter to me. Delia had worked as a parish nurse alongside Merle Fontaine for a decade. She was 84 years old, and she lived in an assisted living place in Opelousas. I'd called her Monday afternoon. She'd said, sharp as a knife, "Wesley Doucet, I was wondering when I'd hear from you," and she'd hung up on me. Ellen and I drove to Opelousas on Wednesday. Emile came with us. Ellen had gone to his house Tuesday morning and knocked on his door and stood there without speaking until he opened it, and then she'd said, "Daddy, you're going to help me now." He had said, "Okay, Ellen." That was all. Delia lived in a place off Highway 190 called Bayou Willow. Her room smelled like the mint candies in the dish by her door and had a picture window looking out at a courtyard where an old man was very slowly pruning a rose bush. Delia was small, upright, dressed in slacks and a cardigan, even though it was July, with her hair set the way old ladies in Louisiana still set their hair, once a week at a beauty parlor. She looked at Ellen for a long time before she said anything. She said, "You've got your mother's mouth." Ellen said, "Ma'am." Delia said, "Sit down, all of you." We sat. She said to Ellen, "You want to know about Merle Fontaine?" Ellen said, "Yes, ma'am." Delia said, "Merle Fontaine was a midwife for 43 years in this parish. She caught more babies than any doctor. Most of what she did was good work. Some of it wasn't." She paused. She looked at Ellen. Some children she brought into the world came out, set wrong. Not sick, not slow. Set wrong. Later on, some of them did things nobody could explain. Merle used to say, "A baby's first breath was a door, and some doors don't close all the way." That was the kind of talk she did. "Old country talk," Ellen said. "Was I one of them?" Delia said, "I don't know, Chair." Ellen said, "Ma'am, you called it. You said Wesley Doucet. I was wondering when I'd hear from you. You knew I'd call." Delia said, "Because your mama called me too. Once." The room went very quiet. Delia said, "November of 73. She was 3 months along with you. She'd been into the parish clinic where I was working, and she'd been talking to me about her worries. Second-time pregnancy. She was scared. She didn't tell me this, but there was talk. She'd had trouble the year before, lost one early. She was scared she'd lose you too. She asked me if Merle Fontaine was somebody a woman could trust." Delia's face didn't change. I told her no. I told her flat out no. I told her go to a doctor. Go to Lafayette. Don't you go anywhere near Merle. She thanked me. She left. "She went to Merle anyway," Ellen said. "You don't know she did." Delia said, "Chair, I know she did." Emile was looking at his hands. Delia said, "Merle burned a lot of things when she was made to stop practicing in 78. She burned her ledgers. She burned her records. She didn't burn everything. Some of us who worked with her kept a copy or two of what we thought we might need someday. Old woman insurance." She turned her head and looked at Emile. She said, "Emile, you want to tell them, or you want me to?" Emile said, "Delia, I never." Delia said, "Emile Aubrey, don't you sit in my room and lie to me. Your wife came to Merle. You know she did. You paid Merle." Ellen said, "Daddy." Emile put his face in his hands. He didn't cry. He just sat there with his hands over his face and his shoulders up around his ears. Ellen watched him. She didn't move. Delia said, "Y'all listen to me. What Merle did wasn't midwifery. Midwifery was what she used it for. What she really did, she learned from an old woman named Agnes Bouquet, who ran the home for unwed mothers out on Purdue Road from the 20s on. Agnes was a nun who got put out of her order for something nobody would tell me the truth about. Agnes taught Merle. Agnes taught Merle everything she knew, and then Agnes died in 62, and Merle kept doing it. And I don't fully understand it, and I don't want to, and I never asked. But I know what the shape of it was." Ellen said, "What was the shape of it?" Delia said, "Trades, Chair. Agnes traded. Merle traded. You brought them something they couldn't get themselves, and they gave you something you couldn't get any other way. Agnes had a lot of desperate girls come through that house, and she used the desperate ones. Merle had a lot of desperate mothers, and she used the desperate ones too. What they took as small pieces, a hair, a breath, a name, and what they gave in. Arrangements. Arrangements that lasted. Ellen said, "What did my mother trade for?" Emil lifted his face out of his hands. He said, "You, Chair. She traded for you. I want to say something before I keep going. I've been telling this whole thing like it happened at the pace it happened, and it didn't. It happened faster in some places, and slower in others. What I'm doing now is trying to lay it out so you can follow it. But the truth is, sitting in Delia Thibodeau's room in Opelousas on that Wednesday afternoon, with my father-in-law's face in his hands, and my wife's spine gone straight against the back of her chair, I couldn't have told you what day it was. Time got funny in the middle of it. I had 1 week to save my daughter, and the world had gone quiet around me, like the air had thickened. Emil told it. He told it looking at the corner of the room, not at Ellen. He said Colette had lost a baby in the summer of '72. He said she'd almost died from it, the bleeding was so bad. He said the doctor in Lafayette had told her another one might kill her. He said she'd gotten pregnant with Ellen anyway in the spring of '73, because they'd wanted her so bad, and he wasn't going to make Colette promise him she wouldn't try again. He said in November of '73, Colette went to see Merle Fontaine on her own. She didn't tell Emile until after. When she told him she'd asked Merle to do something to keep the baby alive. He said he asked her what she meant. He said she said, "A working." Merle did a working. She said it would hold. He said he told her he didn't believe in that. He said she didn't either, but it couldn't hurt. He said he'd paid Merle $200 in cash that December. Merle had come by the house to collect. He said Merle had stood on his porch and looked at Colette's belly and said, "This is a strong one. This one will come through." Then Merle had left. He said Colette had gone into labor on Valentine's Day 1974. He said Merle had come. He said the labor had been bad, but the baby had come. Ellen had come, screaming and pink and healthy, at 11 minutes after 11 at night. He said Colette had held her. He said Colette had said her name, the name she'd picked, and Merle had heard it, and Merle had written something down on a piece of paper. He said then Colette had started to bleed. He said Merle had tried to stop it, and hadn't been able to. He said Colette had died at 3:14 in the morning of February 15th, 1974. Emile said. Merle stood over her. She stood right over Colette's body with the baby in her arms, and she said, "Emile, this baby's borrowed. I done what she asked, and there's a price for the doing. When your girl is grown, I'll be back for what's mine." She said, "Don't you tell her nothing. Don't you name her what her mama named her. You name her something else, and you don't let her know me," he said. "I was 23 years old. My wife was on the bed dead. My daughter was in that woman's arms. I would have signed anything Merle put in front of me. I said okay. I said okay to whatever she wanted." He said, "I named you Ellen because it was my grandmother's name. I never told anybody the name your mama picked. I never told you. I never even said it to myself, Chair. I was scared to say it. I was scared saying it would call her." Ellen said, quiet. "What was the name, Daddy?" Emile closed his eyes. He said, "Marguerite. She wanted to name you Marguerite Colette Aubry." Ellen made no sound. Her face did not change. She sat there in her chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at her father from across a distance that was not physical. Delia said, "Ellen, you listen to me now. Your daddy was 23. Your daddy did what any man would have done. Don't you hold what he did against him?" Ellen didn't answer. I said, "Delia, Merle died in '89. Delia said, "She did." I said, "Then how did she hug me at my mill 4 weeks ago?" Delia said, "That's the question, isn't it?" I said, "Do you know?" Delia said, "I don't, but I know somebody who might." Guidry came to our house Wednesday night. He didn't call first. He drove up around 9, in plain clothes and his personal truck instead of the cruiser, and he knocked on our door with his hat in his hand. Cora was already in bed. Ellen let him in. He sat at our kitchen table, and he took the coffee Ellen poured him, and he did not touch it. He said, "Wes, Ellen, I'm going to tell you all what I know, because my wife had a dream last night that put the fear of God in me, and because I owe your daddy, Ellen, a debt from a long time ago that I've been paying wrong." Ellen said, "Sheriff," Guidry said, "call me Doyle, Ellen. I've known you since you were 6. Ellen said, "Doyle, talk." He talked. He said in February of '74, he'd been a young deputy, 24 years old, 6 months on the job. He'd caught the call to the Aubrey house on the 15th. Colette Aubrey had died. He'd driven out to make the report. He said when he'd pulled up in the yard, he'd seen Merle Fontaine coming out the front door with a bundle under her arm. She'd walked past his cruiser without looking at him, and she'd gotten in her own car, an old white Buick, he said. He remembered it because it was too big a car for such a little woman, and she'd driven off. He said he'd assumed the bundle was bloody sheets. Midwife on her way home from a bad delivery. That was what it looked like. He said he'd gone inside, and Emile had been sitting on the floor next to the bed, with Colette on it, and a baby in a basket beside her, screaming. And he'd done what a young deputy does at a scene like that, which was nothing but wait for the coroner. He said 3 weeks later, Merle Fontaine had come to his mother's house in town. He was still living with his mother then. He said his mother had let Merle in, and Merle had sat at his mother's kitchen table and given his mother a small cloth pouch tied with black thread, and told her, "Miss Guidry, you keep this under your boy's pillow, and your boy will live a long, safe life. He was kind to me on a bad night. I don't forget kindness." His mother had thanked her, and Merle had left. He said his mother had put the pouch under his pillow that same night without telling him, and it had stayed there for years. He said he had not known about it until his mother died in 1998, and he'd cleaned out her house and found the pouch, still under the pillow of his old childhood bed, in a room she hadn't changed in 40 years. He said, "I'm 58 years old. I've never been shot at. I've never been in a wreck. I never had cancer. I never lost a child. My daddy died at 42 of a bad heart, and I got my daddy's heart. And here I sit, 58 years old, with a good heart. My whole life I've been the luckiest man I know." He said, "Wes, when you walked into my office and asked me about that house, about that woman, I about had a heart attack in my chair. Because I've known since '98 that something wasn't right with my luck, and I've spent 8 years not looking at it. And your question was the first time somebody put it on my desk and made me look at it." He said, "I've been telling myself for 8 years I was going to burn that pouch. I never have." He looked at me, he said, "I'm telling you now, because y'all are in something I recognize the edges of, and I owe your family, and because my wife's dream last night was of Merle Fontaine, standing in our bedroom doorway, with a baby in her arms, and the baby was Cora." Ellen sucked in a breath. Guidry said, "I don't know what any of this is. I know it's real. Delia Thibodeau ain't the woman you want. Delia's told you what she'll tell you. There's a man out on the basin who knows more than Delia does, and who never left the parish, and who might tell y'all if you sit still for it. His name is Boo Melancon," I said. "The old man from the diner." Guidry said, "Yeah, he walked out on you. He didn't walk out because he didn't want to talk to you. He walked out because he wanted to talk to you somewhere the others couldn't hear." Ellen said, "Sheriff, Doyle, what did the sheriff before you know about that house?" Guidry said, "Everything, Chair, and nothing he'd write down. The parish has known about that house since before I was born. There's a lot of us who know some. Nobody knows all. That's how Agnes and Merle both wanted it." I said, "Doyle, there's a cypress marker in the woods behind the house. 1962. He said, "I know." I said, "You knew." He said, "I've known since '76. I put flowers on it twice a year the first 10 years I was a deputy, because the sheriff before me asked me to." I never asked him why. I said, "You've been putting flowers on that marker." He said, "Not for a long time now. I stopped when he died, but somebody has kept it up. There's always flowers there. Fresh." Ellen said, "Who is it a marker for?" Guidry said, "It's Agnes Bocquet's grave." Ellen said, "She's not in the parish cemetery." Guidry said, She wouldn't be buried in it. She wasn't in her order anymore, and she was something the diocese didn't want. She's buried on her own land, I said, and Merle's in the parish cemetery. Guidry said, Merle asked to be. Merle paid for her plot in advance, and she left specific instructions. Above-ground vault, closed casket, no viewing, buried in her own dress. Sheriff before me made sure it was done the way she wanted. I don't know why. Ellen said, I do. Everybody looked at her. She said, she wanted to be findable. The three of us sat around that table for a long minute in the kitchen light with our coffee going cold. Guidry said, Boo Melancon lives at a fishing camp off Whiskey Bay. I'll draw y'all a map. He told us. He talked for an hour, and I'm not going to give it all back to you the way he gave it. Some of it was in French I don't speak. Some of it was in that careful sideways way old people out here talk about things they're afraid of, where they name it around the edges and never come at it head on. What he told us amounted to this. Agnes Bouquet had brought something with her from her old order when she was put out of it. Boo wouldn't say what. He said his mama had said it was a devotion. He said it was tied up with a saint the church didn't recognize anymore. Saint Marguerite of the Threshold, who was supposed to look after women who died giving birth. Agnes had used her time at the home on Old Purdue Road to work that devotion into something bigger and darker than the church would have permitted, if the church had known. The heart of it was this. Agnes had figured out, or believed she had figured out, and by the middle of her life it didn't matter which, that when a woman died in the same moment her child was born, the door between the two of them stayed open for a little while. Not long. Long enough for something to be placed. Long enough for a piece of a person who wasn't the mother to be pushed through, and for that piece to settle into the child. That was the working. That was what Merle had done to Ellen. The mother had to consent. That was the rule. It had to be a trade. The mother had to ask for the working, and the mother had to give something, and the mother had to know she was giving it. Colette had asked. Colette had given a lock of her hair. Colette had given the name. The name was the anchor. The name the mother chose for the child was the leverage. Whoever knew the name and could say it out loud had a hand on the child forever. That was why Merle had told Emile to call her Ellen. That was why Emile had. That was why Ellen had gone 32 years without knowing her own true name. The piece Merle had pushed through into Ellen wasn't the whole of Merle. Boo was clear on that. It was a seed, is how his mama had said it. A seed you plant and let grow. It grew silent for decades. It grew inside the child, while the child grew up and got married and had a child of her own and worked at a credit union and made lists on a legal pad. It didn't wake up until the year the practitioner picked. Merle had picked Ellen's 32nd year because 32 had been Merle's own age when she'd started her practice with Agnes. The seed had woken in June. The walking was the seed testing its geography. The humming was the seed rehearsing its voice. The pouches in our house, the ones we'd found, were anchors too. Physical ones, placed by Merle before Emile ever sold the house to us. That house had been Merle's staging ground since 1974. She'd placed the pouches when Ellen was small, and she'd come back and refresh them whenever a new person joined the household. Cora's pouch had been placed sometime in 2000, in Cora's closet, before Cora was old enough to remember. My pouch had been placed a month ago, after the old woman at the mill had taken a lock of my hair. The purpose of the seed was to prepare a room, a borrowed room, Boo called it, a body ready to be moved into. Boo said, the seed itself don't take over. The seed just softens the floor. The one who put the seed in has to come do the moving in herself, and she has to do it while she's still findable. Her body has to be somewhere on this earth for her soul to move from it to the borrowed room. That's the rule. If her body's destroyed before the moving fails and she's just gone. I said, Merle's been dead 17 years. Boo said, Merle been buried 17 years. That ain't the same thing. Ellen said, the woman at the mill. Boo said, I don't know what that was, Chair. I'll be honest with you. I have never in my life heard of what your husband describes. Merle should not have been walking around 4 weeks ago. Merle should have been in her coffin waiting for her night. That she wasn't, that means something I don't understand. That means somebody's been moving pieces I don't know about. Ellen said, Boo, Cora. Boo looked at her. He said, Chair, that's the other thing. He said, in my mama's telling, the working can jump, once, from the borrowed room to a daughter of the borrowed room, if the daughter is under 7, and the working ain't been entered yet. Because a mama's body is porous to her daughter, is how my mama said it. There's a way the practitioner writes it into her own book at the start. It's a clause, a rider. Nobody used to do it, because nobody used to want to wait that long. But Agnes did. Agnes did it a couple times, my mama said. Ellen said, so. Boo said, so if the seed woke in you, and you don't take the moving in, if we get the seed out of you before the moving, the seed can jump to your girl, if that clause was wrote. And if that clause was wrote, the seed's already been getting ready to jump, because it knew there'd be a girl. It's been getting ready to jump since Cora was born. Ellen said, that's why Cora hears it. Boo said, that's why Cora hears it. I said, then getting the seed out of Ellen doesn't save her. It puts it in our daughter. Boo said, not if we destroy the practitioner first. If Merle's body's gone, the seed's got nowhere to be moved from. It's just sitting in y'all's house. It'll fade. It'll go to nothing over a year or two. Nobody moves in. Ellen said, how do we destroy the practitioner? Boo said, you burn her, in her own grave, with fire from her own hearth. And you say the true name of the room she picked, so she knows you're the ones who beat her. Ellen said, Marguerite Colette Aubry. Boo said, yes, Chair. Ellen sat quiet for a long time. She said, Boo, there's a marker at 1962 in the woods behind Merle's house. He said, that's Agnes's. I put flowers on it 3 times a year. Have since 62. My mama asked me to before she died. Ellen said, you've been putting flowers on Agnes Bouquet's grave for 44 years. Boo said, because my mama believed if you didn't keep a peace with the dead ones like Agnes, the dead ones came to see you. My mama was a scared woman her whole life, and I was a scared boy, and it was easier than not doing it. And it kept me clear of the parish for a long time. Nobody bothered Boo Melanchon, because Boo Melanchon was the boy who put flowers on the old sister's marker. That's the truth. I said, Boo, the pouches, what do we do with them? He said, you bring them tonight. You bring them, and I'll show you how they go. There's an order. Oldest first. Ellen said, and Merle. Boo said, Merle's in the parish cemetery in an above-ground vault. She's the last thing. If we do the pouches on Agnes's grave first, that'll unhook the seed from you. Then we go to Merle's vault, and we burn what's in it. Then it's done. He looked at both of us. He said, it has to be tonight, Chair. Y'all don't got 9 days. The seed's woke. Every night it's stronger. Y'all got tonight, and maybe 2 more. If it's already talking to your girl through her mama, it's later than any working I ever heard tell of. Tonight. We drove home. Ellen didn't speak for the first 10 miles. Then she said, Wes, Emil's got to be there. I said, baby, do you want him there? She said, no, but he's going to be. He was there when the working was done, and he's going to be there when we unhook it. That's how you make it come out even. I said, okay. She said, and Doyle? I said, Doyle already offered. She said, good. I said, Ellen, who's watching Cora tonight? She said, Daddy will bring her when he comes. She's not going to be out of my sight. I said, Ellen, no. Ellen, we can't take Cora. Ellen said, Wes, the one thing we know for a fact is that whatever this is, it doesn't want Cora to be out of that house. Whatever it is, knows where our daughter is. If we leave her at Randy's, or at Ruth's, or at a hotel, and it decides to come looking, it'll go to her. If she's with me, I can put my body between hers and it. If she's not, I can't. She stays with me. I couldn't argue with her. She was right, and she was wrong at the same time, and I couldn't argue with her. I called Emil from the truck. He answered on the first ring. I told him where to meet us and when. He said okay. He said, Wesley. I said, yeah. He said, I've been ready for tonight for 32 years. Tell my daughter I'm sorry. Tell her I know it don't mean nothing, but tell her anyway. I said, Tell her yourself, Emil. He said. I will. He hung up. Ellen didn't ask me what he'd said. She was looking out the passenger window with her hand pressed flat against the glass, and I could see her lips moving. She was saying her name to herself, over and over. Quiet. Marguerite Colette Aubry. Marguerite Colette Aubry. Marguerite Colette Aubry. Like she was trying to make it fit. We got to the shotgun house at 9 that night. Emil was already there in his truck. Cora was in the cab with him, wrapped in her little mermaid blanket, holding Mr. Beans, asleep. Guidry was there in his truck too, in his uniform this time, with a shotgun across his knees. Boo pulled up last in his old Ford. He had a 5-gallon can of kerosene in the bed, and a coffee can full of ash he'd dug out of the shotgun house's cold chimney that afternoon. Nobody said much. Ellen took Cora out of Emil's cab and carried her to my truck. She laid her down in the back seat. Cora didn't wake up. She was breathing steady. Ellen tucked the blanket around her and touched her cheek and did not cry. We walked around the back of the shotgun house together, single file. Boo led with a flashlight. The path Deputy Trosclair had described was clear now. You could see it by lamplight, the grass beaten down, the way it curved between 2 big oaks. The clearing was small. The cypress marker was in the middle of it. Coneflowers were laid at the foot of it, fresh. Somebody had been here today. Boo looked at Guidry. Guidry shook his head. He said, Doyle Guidry hasn't been out here in 8 years, Boo. Boo said, then somebody else been coming. He didn't say who. He didn't have to. We laid the pouches on Agnes Bouquet's grave in the order Boo told us. The oldest one first, the little brittle one from the attic, with the single fingernail inside. Then Ellen's, the one from under the porch step with the lock of auburn hair. Then Cora's, the one from behind her closet baseboard with the fine baby hair. Then Colette's name pouch, the one from Ellen's pillow. Then mine, the one from behind our medicine cabinet. Boo built a small fire on the grave from twigs and pine straw, and the ash from Merle's chimney. He started it with a kitchen match. He didn't say anything ceremonial. He just built a fire, he said to Ellen. When it catches, Chair, you say it. The fire caught. Ellen said, Marguerite Colette Aubry. She said it clear. She said it in her own voice. She said it like a woman claiming a name back. The fire took the first pouch, the old one from the attic. It went up in a little sharp flare, and I smelled something that wasn't like anything I've ever smelled. Not like burning cloth, not like burning hair. Sweeter and older, like a smell from a room you weren't allowed in as a kid. The second pouch went. Ellen's. Ellen fell. She went down on her knees in the leaf mold beside the grave, and she caught herself on her hands, and she made a sound like someone had punched her. Emil lunged for her. She waved him off. She said, I'm all right. I'm all right. Keep going. Keep going. The third pouch. Cora's baby hair. Ellen made the same sound. Softer. The fourth. The one with her mother's name. Ellen sat back on her heels. Her eyes were streaming. She wasn't crying. She was just leaking. Her whole face wet. Running. The fifth. Mine. I felt something too. I've never known how to describe it. Like a hair I hadn't known was on the back of my neck being pulled off. That was all. A small physical relief in a place I hadn't known was tense. The fire burned. The pouches were ash. Ellen was on her hands and knees breathing hard. Then she gasped, a sharp inward breath, and she looked up. She looked past us. Toward my truck, toward Cora. She said, Wes. Oh God, Wes. It moved. It's off me. It just moved. It's on her now. We ran. Cora was awake in the back seat of my truck, sitting up, wrapped in her blanket, Mr. Beans in her lap. She was looking straight ahead through the windshield at nothing. Not blinking. Ellen tore open the door and grabbed her. Cora let herself be grabbed. She put her arms around Ellen's neck. She said, in her own voice, in her regular little 6-year-old voice, Mama, she's here. She's really here now. Ellen said, Who, baby? Cora said, The lady, the one you were carrying. She got out of you, and now she's in me. But it's okay, Mama. She's happy. She was tired of waiting. She said she can drive from here. Boo said, Quiet, cemetery. Now, I said. Ellen, give her to Emile. You come with us. Ellen said, I'm not letting her go. I said, then bring her. Bring her with us. All of us. Go. We piled into 2 trucks, Ellen and Cora and me in mine, Guidry and Boo and Emile in Guidry's cruiser. Boo had the kerosene. Guidry had the shotgun and the tire iron out of his trunk. Emile had a small canvas bag he'd brought from home that I hadn't asked about. The parish cemetery was 15 minutes across town. I drove it in 11. Ellen sat in the middle of the bench seat with Cora in her lap. Cora was calm. Cora was humming. Ellen said, Baby, don't hum. Cora said, Sorry, Mama. She stopped for a minute. Then she said, Mama. Ellen said, Yes, baby. Cora said, She says thank you. Ellen said, For what, sweetheart? Cora said, For carrying her so long. She says you took real good care of her. Ellen put her face down in the top of Cora's hair. She kept her face there the rest of the drive. I passed one car. It was a white Buick going the other way on Highway 190. I did not turn my head to look at the driver. I don't know why I didn't. I've thought about it a lot since. The parish cemetery is on the south end of town, past the Baptist church, with a wrought iron gate that isn't locked because in South Louisiana, nobody locks a cemetery. The vaults are above ground because the water table is too high to bury a body 6 feet down. Rows and rows of them, whitewashed, some old, some new, most of them with the family name across the front and the individual names on smaller plaques. Merle Fontaine's vault was in the old section on the north side. Small, single, Fontaine across the front. Under it, a marble plaque with her name and dates. Merle Josephine Fontaine, April 3rd, 1911, October 22, 1989. There were fresh flowers in the little iron vase bolted to the front. Wild ones, cone flowers and black-eyed Susans, cut with a knife. Guidry looked at them. He said, Somebody was here today. Boo said, Somebody's been here all summer. He set down the kerosene. He said to Guidry, You brought the iron. Guidry lifted the tire iron. The vault was closed with a marble faceplate held on by 4 brass bolts. Guidry worked them free one at a time. He was breathing hard. Not from effort, he said. At one point, I have wanted not to do this for 8 years. He got the last bolt. He and Boo lifted the faceplate off together and set it against the vault next to it. The opening was dark. Boo shone the flashlight in. The coffin was inside. Wooden, plain, in good shape. It filled the vault snug. Guidry pried the lid. The nails came out slow, one at a time, with the wet groaning sound old nails make. When the lid was loose, Guidry lifted it off and set it aside. I want to describe what we saw very carefully. Inside the coffin was Merle Fontaine's skeleton, laid out in a black dress. Her hands were folded on her chest. Around her wrist was a rosary made of black beads. On her chest, resting on the folded hands, was a small photograph. The photograph was of Cora. It was taken in the spring at her school. She was in her yellow dress. She was smiling with her missing front teeth. It was a picture we had a copy of at home, sitting on the mantel. Somebody had taken a second print and laid it on Merle Fontaine's chest in a coffin closed since 1989. Ellen made a sound I had never heard her make before. Not a cry, something else. Cora, in her arms, said, Mama, it's okay, that's just her picture. She likes that picture. Boo said, Low. Now, Wes, now. I took the kerosene. I poured it into the coffin. The wood soaked it up. The dress soaked it up. I did not look at the photograph while I did it. I looked at the far wall of the vault, at a spider that had made a web in the corner. Boo said, Ellen. Ellen said, Marguerite Colette Aubry. She said it while I was pouring. She said it the second time, and the third, and the fourth, and I kept pouring until the can was empty, and then I stepped back. Boo lit a road flare. He tossed it into the coffin. The flame took. The vault went bright orange. The heat hit us, and we all stepped back. The coffin burned hot and fast, faster than kerosene alone should have burned. Something in that dress, or that wood, or that woman wanted to burn. Cora, in Ellen's arms, went limp. Ellen said, "Cora, Cora, Cora." I turned. Cora's eyes were closed. Her head was against Ellen's shoulder. She was breathing. She was breathing normally. Her mouth was slack, the way it went slack when she fell asleep in the car. Ellen said, "Baby, baby, wake up." Cora didn't answer. The fire in the vault burned down, not out. The coffin kept burning, but the tall flames went low. Boo watched it for a long time. Nobody spoke. Then Cora took a bigger breath in Ellen's arms. She turned her face into Ellen's neck. She said, sleepy, in her regular voice, "Mama, I want to go home." Ellen sat down on the ground. She sat down right there in the shell path between the vaults, with Cora in her lap, and she rocked her. Boo watched the fire go down to embers. When it was low enough, he stepped up and looked in. He said, "It's done. There's nothing left. It's done, Chair." Ellen kept rocking. Emil stood behind her, with his hand on her shoulder. He was crying without making a sound. His face was slick with it. I stood there beside them with the empty kerosene can in my hand, and I looked around the cemetery in the moonlight, and I felt a thing I had not expected to feel, which was, I don't know how to say it, not relief, not victory, something quieter, like when you finish a piece of work at the mill and it's a good clean cut, and you set down your saw. That kind of thing. We drove home. Cora slept in Ellen's lap the whole way. Ellen didn't put her down. Ellen carried her into the house and up to her bed and lay down beside her, and I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, with my hand on Ellen's ankle, and none of us moved until the sun came up. That was July 6, 2006. Cora's half-birthday came on July 14. Ellen and I sat up all 3 nights before it, and all 3 nights after it. Cora slept through every one of them. She got up in the morning and asked for cereal. She wanted to know if she could have a friend over. She wanted to know why Daddy was sleeping on the floor. Ellen no longer walked. She stopped having the wet cotton dream. She woke up in the morning most days a little tired, but she woke up herself. Every morning I looked at her, and she looked at me, and it was Ellen looking back. Emil moved into our spare room in August. Ellen asked him to. He said he shouldn't. She said, "Daddy, please," and he came. He and Ellen took a long time to say things to each other. Some things they never said out loud, but they said in other ways. The way people do. He plays with Cora most afternoons. He is a good grandfather. He was always a good grandfather. Boo Melancon died on August 3, in his sleep, in his lawn chair on his porch, with an empty Miller in his lap. I went to his funeral. There were 9 people there. His hound dog laid down on the grave when they lowered him in, and would not get up for anybody. The last thing Boo ever said to me, when we shook hands at the cemetery gate that night in July, was, "Doucette, don't let nobody else in that house. Any woman comes to your door, asking after your girl, you don't open it. You hear me?" I said I heard him. Guidry retired in September. His wife hasn't had another dream, so far as I know. He and I don't talk about it. We nod at each other at the co-op. The parish tore down the shotgun house on September 12. I drove past when they were doing it. The bulldozer took it apart in about an hour. There was nothing under the floorboards. There was nothing in the walls. It was just an old house. Father Boudreau blessed our house on September 20th. He didn't say much. He walked the whole house with holy water and a purple stole. When he was done, he stood in the kitchen, and he said to Ellen, "Cher, what happened to your family was a very old thing, older than the parish, older than my church. I do not fully understand it, but it is gone from your house now," he said. "If anything ever comes back, even a small thing, you call me first. Not the sheriff, me." Ellen said she would. Ellen is asleep upstairs. Cora is asleep across the hall. It's October. 26 days past my daughter's half-birthday. Everything is fine. There's 2 things I haven't put on this tape. I'm going to put them on it now because if I don't, nobody will know them, and I've decided that somebody needs to know them besides me. The first one is small. I might be making it into more than it is. Cora used to be right-handed. Since July, she's been left-handed. She switched hands sometime in the last month, and none of us noticed until her teacher called Ellen in September to ask if we knew our daughter was writing left-handed now. Ellen said we hadn't noticed. The teacher said kids sometimes switch. It's normal. It happens. Cora holds her crayon a certain way. She grips it high, close to the point, with her thumb across the top of her fist. It's not the way most left-handed kids hold a crayon. It's not the way she used to hold one right-handed either. It's a way I've only ever seen once. It's the way Merle Fontaine held her pen in the midwifery register in the parish courthouse, in a photograph from 1953 that I looked at in August because I couldn't stop myself. That's the first thing. The second thing is what I found in my truck 2 weeks ago. I was cleaning it out on a Saturday, pulling out fast food bags and receipts, reached under the driver's seat for a coin I heard roll, and my hand hit something that wasn't a coin. It was wedged in the springs. It had been there a while. It had a little dust on it. It was a small cloth pouch, dark stitching, black thread, newer than any of the ones we burned. I sat in the driver's seat with it in my palm for a long time. I opened it. Inside was a lock of hair, my hair, coarser than Ellen's, coarser than Cora's, brown going grey at the temples, the way my hair had started going the last year or two. 3 chicken vertebrae, and a slip of paper folded twice. I unfolded it. The paper was crisp and white. The ink was still shining wet black, not the old brown ink of the older pouches, not even the black ink of the one from behind the medicine cabinet. Fresh, new. Written in the last month, maybe the last week. The name on the paper was Wesley David Doucet. I have not shown it to Ellen. I have not shown it to Emile. I have it in the drawer under the silverware right now, underneath the takeout menus, in a Ziploc. I don't know who put it there. I don't know when. I don't know if it was placed before we burned Merle in her vault, and it's inert now, just a piece of paper and some hair and some bones in a bag, or if it was placed after, by somebody I haven't accounted for, and it's warm. Cora's half-birthday came and went. She is fine. She has been fine every night I've checked on her, every 40 minutes, since the 5th of July. I don't know why I keep checking every 40 minutes if she's fine. I don't know why I'm the one who sleeps on the couch now, and Ellen and Cora share the bed. I don't know why the box fan in our bedroom still hitches sometimes, and I still come up out of sleep at 3:14 in the morning, even though Ellen hasn't walked in 3 months. Boo said the seed fades if the practitioner's body is destroyed. It fades over a year or 2. That's what he said. Boo also said, and I've thought about this a lot, Merle wasn't the one who called this room. Merle was just the carpenter. Whoever's coming, Merle was building the house for them. I asked him at the cemetery, while the vault was still burning, what he meant by that. He said he didn't rightly know. He said his mama had told him once that Agnes had had a pupil before Merle, a first one, a girl she'd taught in the 20s, a girl who'd left the parish before Merle ever came along, and gone somewhere Agnes wouldn't say. He said his mama had never known her name. He said Merle had been the second student, not the first. I think about that sometimes. I think about the woman at the mill. I think about the way she hugged me. I think about how I described her to Emile on the phone, and he said Merle had been dead 17 years. I think about how sure Emile was. He had known Merle. He would know Merle. The woman at the mill was not Merle. I don't know who the woman at the mill was. I don't know whose pouch is in the drawer under my silverware. It's 3:12 a.m. I'm going to go upstairs and lie down next to my wife and my daughter. In 2 minutes, I'll know if this is over.